inviare la linea su YouTube. Perfetto. Good afternoon, everyone. This is the first plenary session of our conference, and it focuses on the National Recovery and the Resilience Plan and the macroeconomic outlook for our country. I would like to thank Professor Anna Maria Simonazzi of the University of Rome La Sapienza, Professor Tamburini of the University of Trento, and Professor Zezza of the University of Cassino for accepting our invitation to discuss these issues. The scheduled time for each intervention is 25-30 minutes in order to have 10 minutes of discussion and question from the audience after each intervention. We have changed the order of the session, so the first presentation is the one of Professor Tamburini, and the title of his presentation is The Future of the Governance of the Monetary Union Beyond New Rules. So I give you the floor, Professor Tamburini.
Okay. Thank you very much, Chairman, and good afternoon to everybody. I'm quite happy to give my contribution to this very interesting and timely meeting and workshop. The usual question is, can you see the slides? Perhaps I can set them on full screen, okay?
Yes, we
see. Okay? Oh, great. Okay, well. So, yes, the title of my presentation is The Future of the Governance of the Monetary Union. And the subtitle is, as usual, the important part of the story that I want to tell to you, which is Beyond New Rules. So let me start from some introductory overview of the new environment in which we live. Much of what I'm going to say in this first part is just in line what Francesco Saraceno presented this morning. The point is that the conception of the governance of the EMU is 30 years old. And reform is needed because the system did not work well, and it seems that this is one important point always to remark. It didn't work well in the past decade, to say the least, and it is not fit for the future. So any reform must take, or even the refusal to reform, must take account of changed circumstances. And the list of circumstances is, as I said, basically the same that Francesco presented this morning. The demise of the Washington, Frankfurt, Brussels consensus embedded in the Maastricht Treaty. The pre-COVID European fiscal rules, as he explained very well, were the product of the cultural climate prevailing in the 1980s and 90s, when faith in the self-regulation of markets was unlimited. The belief in the need for active fiscal policies was limited, and monetary policy was seen as a universal panacea for residual stabilization purposes. And we have known that this is not the case for some time now. Second circumstance is that we have discovered the weaknesses of monetary policy alone in tackling deep recessions, and larger use of fiscal policy for the purpose of stabilization and related macroeconomic externalities must be carefully considered. Third, we have the high debt legacy, in part from the previous crisis, and most of all after the pandemic necessity to save our lives and our economies, so that the 60% threshold for debts is entirely unrealistic, and not only in Southern Europe. And the idea of approaching that target at any speed, in any case, would create such a squeeze of demand capable of throwing the continent back into recession. And fourth, we know that from now onward, there is an extraordinary, anything but temporary, budgetary effort ahead, because in part from domestic reasons, in part from the new agenda set by the European Union itself, the agenda of fiscal policy, of national fiscal policies, is very thick and quite demanding. The NGU will last for a few years, and then, of course, we should ask ourselves what can be done later. The old rules also have well-known technical bugs. Again, nothing new here, especially for this audience. Very quickly, pro-cyclicality. Second, the lack of consideration of the spillovers and aggregate effects of country-by-country fiscal prescriptions. The third is increasing complexity, decreasing robustness, and opaque flexibility. Let me anticipate one point. We do not want rigid rules with flexibility. We want a different system of governing public finance in Europe. That could be a slogan, but I think it should be stressed. And finally, we have also discovered that major threats to the integrity of the EMU come from systemic shocks. And we have seen that we were entirely unfit to address and resolve systemic shocks. So, as I said, the main message is that we should go beyond some technical restyling of fiscal rules. This is necessary, but is not the only, perhaps not the most important part of the story in our view. And renewed fiscal rules should rest on renewed political economic pillars. First pillar is moving from horizontal to vertical coordination. The do your homework alone era is over, and it should by now be clear that maintaining fiscal policy entirely at the level of individual member countries, constrained by a set of rules which ignore macroeconomic externalities, is no longer possible. Individual budgetary policies must not only be controlled, but also be coordinated and harmonized to maintain a balanced Eurozone fiscal stance. This is an instance that has been around well before the pandemic, in order to minimize negative spillovers from individual budgetary policies onto other member states. Another important point that is often disregarded is that large and flexible central budget at the EU level is a necessary precondition in order to keep members' budgets small and disciplined. This is the lesson that comes from existing and successful federal entities. You cannot have both very large jurisdictions with large and extensive fiscal competencies and pretend to keep them under strict control. Federal states that have jurisdiction with small and controllable budget, it is because they have a sufficiently large and flexible central budget. So in this perspective, NGU and particularly instruments like SURE are the necessary complement to keep national budgeted constraints that might be more politically acceptable and be easier to control, exactly for the reasons that I have just recalled. Second pillar is a clear distinction between technical evaluation and political responsibility. So we should resist perpetuating the harmful illusion that in a democratic Europe, automatic algorithms may or should replace the so-called political discretion, which I stress once more is not flexibility, of rules is another thing. As Paul Samuelson once said, any automatic mechanism is set up by discretion, is abandoned by discretion, and is interfered with by discretion. Rules are useful to create a framework for technical evaluation of the state of public finances in various member states and the EMU as a whole. But whenever technical evaluation must be translated into political decisions, competence should be assigned to political responsible institutions. And we know in the EMU, political responsibility stays with member state governments. However, national governments must agree to share sovereignty with a higher order institution capable of guaranteeing the EU collective interests. In our view, such an institution can only be the European Commission, and for sure, the latter must make use of independent technical structures such as the European Fiscal Board and the national parliamentary budget offices for technical analysis and the formulation of guidelines for the implementation of standards. And in this perspective, we side with Blanchard that the important thing as guidelines, not necessarily targets. So this is the very sketchy view of the two new pillars onto which the new rules should be grafted. So new rule number one, there is growing consensus that the focus should shift from annual budget to public debt sustainability assessment for various reasons. As a minimal remark, the two variables are related, and hence having a target on both is logically inconsistent. One of the two is redundant given the other. There may be or not a debt target level. This is an open issue. It's more technical, but I do not go deeper into this detail. There may be or not a debt target level, but DSA is a more comprehensive framework within which the current state of public finance and its future evolution are determined. Also, DSA is the appropriate framework into which short-term stabilization contingency should be evaluated. And fourth important point, while conducted at the single member state level, DSA also necessitates attention to the cross-country spillovers. Coming to implementation, of course, I repeat, I'm very brief on this. I sent the paper joined with Andrea Boitani, which expands more on this proposal. The basic idea of implementation is that the DSA should be performed on individual member states periodically, taking account of specific features of each member state with reference to growth, population dynamics, interest rate trends, etc., but also current budgetary policy and those planned for the future. As I said, there is a clear distinction here. Technical analysis is entrusted to a strengthened European Fiscal Board in conjunction with similar institution existing at the national level. Then, on the basis of the DSA, perhaps on proposal of the EFB, the Commission agrees a debt trajectory over some future years with the country concerned. And here, let me quote again from Blanchard's proposal: the debt sustainability risks are to be balanced against the costs of adjustment in terms of production, with the explicit goal of averting a debt crisis for the individual country and the EMU as a whole. New rule number 2 is primary spending controls with counter-cyclical and public investment safeguards. Let me say that this is, personally, I'm not sure that moving to primary spending controls, however defined, is the solution of all problems. I have some doubts of this. Gennaro this morning also raised some questions. But let me say that this can be seen as a first step forward with respect to the status quo. There is a growing convergence on this idea of using primary spending as a tool to achieve the planned debt trajectory. Basically, from the point of view that there is the idea that it can allow some simplification and transparency. How could it work? In the event that a debt reduction plan is deemed necessary, a primary spending path, act as a ceiling, could be devised. And this can be gauged with rather simple standard debt dynamics model from which we can work out what is the tool to be determined. That this promises to be less awkward than the system which is in place now. But I say, as I said before, I don't want to go into these details. The other promising idea is that using the primary spending path as a control instrument under the commitment and surveillance system described above will allow to accommodate ex ante, this is important, some desirable allowances. Expenditure in growth-friendly and EU priority public goods, we know what they are, is of course the first thing that comes to mind, and therefore a tailored version of golden rule is a necessary tool. So the stress is not, the question is not if, but how. And the second is that also expenditures related to automatic stabilizers identified as those embedded in existing legislation can be find a due allowance. Let me stress that ex ante means that these items are defined ex ante a priori in general terms and even on a detailed basis. So it is not a matter to pick them out from the hat when the moment comes. There is a list of allowances that can be made, and this is defined before, and it can be activated if there is the necessity to do that. So this picture summarizes very simply the idea is a flow chart that highlights the three moments of the assessment, commitment, and surveillance model that we have in mind. And you see that each moment has different main characters on the stage. Assessment is conducted more at the technical level, European Fiscal Board, National Fiscal Board, etc. The real important part is commitment, which is a political process, commission and government. And then there is a surveillance phase in which there is a double level. One is political, commission and peers, and the other one is, of course, technical support by the technical bodies that I mentioned before. So this is, in a nutshell, the idea. Finally, of course, we should take into account the usual, and let me say, not entirely groundless claim for enforcement, questions, issues of moral hazard, and all that. There are various proposals around on this ground. Perhaps one that is more consistent with the general view of having a more important role of the central dimension of fiscal policy is some form of exclusion from EU funds. Of course, for this kind of let me call it punishment or enforcement mechanism, it must be that the access to EU funds in this picture should be relevant. Okay, the skin in the game should be relevant. Otherwise, who cares? Right. But let me also add one idea, that is the following: the natural enforcement mechanism that complements the regulatory system we have devised is reputation. The standard cynical economists may start laughing at the word reputation. Okay, reputation may exert a soft pressure, but this depends on the framework, on the general framework and the general construction of the procedure. In the procedure that I have outlined, reputation is the natural complement, because the process is not based on compliance with rules imposed by technocrats, but compliance with political agreements with the Commission. Okay, so this is a different approach. And let me say that if we believe that the European integration process is supported by citizens, so this is not just a lip service to this fundamental idea. We should also be confident that citizens will give sufficient weight to the reputation of their own government in respecting its commitments freely agreed with European partners and the Commission. So this is also a way to enhance the centrality of the European dimension of the government, and hopefully this should be considered in the domestic political processes. And anyway, let me say, what is the alternative? We know that all the paraphernalia of sanction and punishment that have been put up in the past, we know didn't work very well. I think that this is this stress on reputation, however immaterial it may appear, may be a real game changer in the relationship between electors, governments, and the European Union. So I stop here, and I'm very happy to answer to questions and give further clarifications. Okay, thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Tamburini, for your contribution. And of course, I completely agree with you that the present fiscal rules has to be changed for several reasons. And I would like only to make two observations. The first one is that, as you suggest, the laws of some fiscal sovereignty by the member states of the European Union may have sense if at the same time you have a federal budget whose composition and dimension is decided and voted by a political institution, for instance, specifically by the European Parliament. And the other point is specifically reading your paper with Boitani. You refer to a sustainability analysis by the European Commission of the public debt. And I wonder what kind of sustainability analysis you have in mind. You mentioned Blanchard, you say that the European Commission would have to agree a deficit reduction trajectory over several years with the countries involved. But, you know, theoretically, there is not a shared definition of sustainability, and the required policy measures can be very different according to the way by which the sustainability is calculated. And moreover, sustainability of public debt is influenced by monetary policy. So, as I said, also tomorrow, this morning, we should also implement, I think, some kind of reform of the European Central Bank. But I leave this to the discussion by the public. So, if there is some question from the audience, perhaps Francesco Saraceno has something to say. First, Anna Simonazzi.
Thank you. Well, my questions are very similar to the ones that has just been raised. The first point is that you should emphasize that the whole problem of debt sustainability is conditioned to the existence of a federal budget. Otherwise, well, I don't want to be provocative, but I want to understand. It seems to me that your, let's say, your idea of debt sustainability is not very different from the current regime. You take away the numbers, but it sounds as the philosophy is not very different. It's very important that you mention that you should take into consideration cross-country spillovers, but then, and you rely very much on the political rather than the rule-making for definition of this debt sustainability. But, I mean, the debt sustainability of a country is not independent, as you mentioned with the country spillovers, from what happens in the other countries, what happens with the monetary policy, as was mentioned by Sergio Leverero, and above all, it is not independent on the structural features of the different countries. So that sustainability for Greece can be much more difficult to achieve, or for Italy for what matters, under a common currency. I mean, if they don't, if you take away all the difficulties that were met by the various countries in the South, for instance, in joining this monetary union, then you take away a very important point, and that sustainability can be a very vague thing. Who is defining, who is deciding if the debt of Greece, Italy, Portugal, or for what matter Finland, is sustainable or not?
Yes.
So it's, I mean, I would like to understand if there is something very different from the current regime that allows a country to achieve a rate of growth and employment that is suitable for its own future. So that's what bothers me.
Thank you, Anna. Perhaps we can collect all the questions. So, Antonella Stirati.
Okay. Hi, Roberto.
Ciao, Antonella.
Ciao. So, also my questions too are about along the same lines, although perhaps framed a bit differently. Okay, the sustainability of debt. Whatever is the criterion chosen by the bodies involved, objectively depends also on the rate of interest on public bonds and the rate of growth of the economy. Now, the problem is neither of these are given independently of monetary policy on the one hand and fiscal policy on the other. And let me stress this second point. We now know out of the very wide literature on fiscal multipliers and hysteresis that changes in public spending cause permanent, or anyway, very persistent changes in GDP. So, I mean, again, you risk to enter a vicious circle in which you fix a ceiling to expenditure based on the rate of growth, and these ceilings keep in check the actual growth rate of the economy. So how do we go out of this? And of course, then there is the very important role of the central bank concerning the interest rate on public bonds and what we do with that. For Italy, this is a crucial condition for sustainability of public debt, how much you pay in terms of interest rates. Then I have two worries, which are not necessary, which as an economist I cannot frame very clearly, but I think we can understand each other. You say we need a large and flexible central budget. Okay, that would be very nice to have. But how you reconcile that with the fact that the politicians, even the political bodies at the European level that would decide on these are only accountable, do only respond to their domestic electorate? Isn't there here a huge problem of democracy? I mean, the citizens would vote for a certain parliament and government in their own country, but then the decisions, the relevant decisions would be taken elsewhere. And many of the people, I mean, Germany would decide for the Greek and the Portuguese and the Italians and maybe vice versa. And this is not very well, doesn't work, I think. It has created a lot of problems also in the past, no? I mean, this sense that democracy is becoming emptied I think it's a serious worry. So wouldn't a large central budget necessarily require huge constitutional changes which are not in sight? And shouldn't in this respect then be more sensible to have less of a central budget, but more find ways in which individual countries can be more flexible in their decisions about fiscal policy? This is my question.
Hello? I lost.
Ti sentiamo, Roberto, ti sentiamo.
Ok, beh, no, non sentivo io voi. Okay, thank you very much. Of course, a very challenging question, but let me start not with a disclaimer, but just to give a contained dimension to this discussion. The first question is whether we are talking about to stay within a monetary union or not. Second, if we want to stay in a monetary union, should we or can we have fiscal rules or not? And third, what are the alternatives? Okay, I don't want, this question have a slight tone of being provocative, but this is the framework. Within this framework, we tend to figure out something better than this that we have so far. Because, okay, otherwise, we can discuss a lot on all the possible limitation, drawbacks, and costs exceeding benefits to stay within a monetary union. So within these three framing questions, do we want to stay in a monetary union? Does a monetary union need fiscal rules? And what are the alternatives to the present one? Also taking something on the background to some limited extent, because as economists, we should try to say what we think is a good solution, also the political issues. So let me remind that this, of course, I've been very sketchy in the presentation. So in the paper, we have more detail. And of course, there are a lot of technical details to be specified. But let me also stress that this kind of process that we call assessment, commitment, and surveillance, which is based on a clear distinction between technical assessment and political process, presupposes a sufficiently enhanced, if not an institutional, centralized fiscal authority, a EU fiscal budget. That is a complement to this. Otherwise, under various dimensions, of course, it cannot work very well. Is this politically feasible? It's a problem. But again, what are the alternatives? Perhaps one day will come in which the political constituencies or supposed political constituencies, alleged political constituencies that are against the creation of a stronger fiscal capacity, common fiscal capacity, will realize that if they want to stay in a monetary union that works pretty well and does not create problems to themselves, they will need to come to terms with this idea. After all, with some difficulties, but after all, this has happened with COVID-19. We ended up exactly in that direction. So it's possible. But of course, I'm not a politician, and I try to figure out what, as an economist, I think is a good solution. Of course, debt sustainability analysis is not a panacea, is not easy. It has all the complexities that your question have raised. But again, let me stress one point. The whole philosophy is exactly not to have a mechanical system of rules, of algorithms that applies equally to all member countries. That is an analysis which is tailored on each single state in given circumstances. What is the definition and content of sustainability analysis? It is true. Even in the technical literature, there is not one single definition. There are various. The simplest one is that you should be on a debt trajectory that is not explosive, is not going to increase ever and ever. The other possibility is you should aim to sub-target in the future, and this, I don't know, perhaps is more likely. I don't like it, but it's more likely because we don't know what to throw away everything. So must be a target. So that's a problem that should be addressed. Then it can be assessed in terms of divergence with this path that can be devised in one of the two ways that I've mentioned. But let me stress one point. Of course, there are also the endogeneity and spillovers problems that you mentioned. This is the problem of fiscal multipliers. So let's suppose that we can agree that this is done specifically for each country on a base of models. But what is the difference with now? The difference is that we can have a rather sophisticated analysis based on models, possibly in which there are fiscal multipliers and there are macroeconomic externalities, and there is some consideration of the interaction between the aggregate fiscal stance and the monetary policy. But what the point, we can have a rather complex analysis because it is not an automatical triggers of a number on which you have to make a commitment. That's a level of analysis that can be conducted by technicians, by technical bodies, by whatever, and it's a matter of reasoning, confronting the models and scenarios and whatever. So it can be complex, let me say, as we like, because it's not a trigger of a single number that you should comply with. So we can have non-stupid and therefore not easy and complicated as is necessary mechanism of technical assessment. And I hope that there may be, in the end, some agreement on the result. Okay, I'm not saying that it's easy, but we should think it in entirely different framework with respect to what is going on now. So again, I buy all your observations are quite important and surely should be taken into account. But what I wanted to stress is that they should be located in a different perspective, in a different framework, in which we hope that the kind of process that we have devised can work. And let me say more, less ambitiously, it can be better than the present. Okay, let me be incremental, as Popper once said. Technologies bit by bit. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Roberto. And now we can move to the other presentation by Professor Simonazzi, entitled the NRRP, New Paradigm of Business as Usual.
Thank you, but Roberto should take
yes.
His
okay, yes, sure, sorry. Okay.
Again, you have 25-30 minutes for your presentation.
Thank you. Okay. I think that my presentation is complementary to the paper just presented by Roberto, in the sense that it deals with the way in which we can try to make the debt sustainable in the first instance. So I will deal with the National Reform Program, the PNRR in Italian, because this was what I was asked to do. And I will give a very quick overview of the risks and opportunities, trying to give a preliminary assessment of the main points or the main missing points of the plan, and then a few remarks or notes how to implement the plan in order to help the country to make a sustainable debt. So the Next Generation EU has been, I believe this, a huge institutional step forward. It was a proof of solidarity, a bit suffered, but in the end it was reached. And it is also perhaps the embryo of a mutual European fund. This we'll see. The National Reform Program in Italy, on the other hand, is an enormous, unprecedented financial commitment. It is, if we add together the Recovery and Resilience Facility, the Complementary Fund, the Development and Cohesion Fund, and REACT-EU program, we reach 261 billion euros. These are most loans, and these loans must be paid back. And this is one important point to be well kept in mind, because its consequences, for better or for worse, will affect future economic developments. It's huge in size, but also huge in scope. 6 missions, 16 components, 43 areas of intervention, covering practically all sectors and almost all sensitive issues. At the end, I will say that there are important sectors, issues left out. There are specific tasks or missions, and among these, the transition to green economy, a digital economy, sustainable mobility, improvements in research, healthcare, social inclusion, and cohesion. There are cross priorities: gender equality, youth, and reduction of the gaps in standards of living. And the plan includes also an ambitious reform program with contextual reforms, public administration, justice, simplification, legislation, and promotion of competition. One point which I think is sort of characterizing then the plan is that it is perhaps too hasty. The development and presentation of the plan were conditioned by the limited times dictated by the need to give a timely response to the crisis triggered by the pandemic. And Italy's plan was transmitted by the government to the European Commission on April the 30th, 2021, and immediately after to the Italian Parliament. This is not an unimportant point. The Parliament has been sort of taken aside from the discussion. By the way, this is not my main point. Investments within the Recovery and Resilience Facility must be made within 5 years. That is, they must be completed by 2026. And this is another point which is important, because Italian experience with structural funds and other public funding, last not least the funds allocated for the earthquake of 2016, shows that the use of funds represents one of the most delicate points of program implementation. So, strengthening the administrative machinery and the digital transformation of the public administrations are fundamental for the management of the plan. Still, creating an efficient and regenerated public administration with the entry of new human resources is not, it takes time. So that special care must be paid to the local administration, which will be in charge of a considerable part of the plan. Local administration, not only central administration, and this is a problem. A simple remark, mission accomplished, the 51 milestones. Are this showing that we have become better in implementing the expenditures? Well, not really, because mostly these are regulatory policy and administrative acts with indications for the realization of the commitments for future installments. Legislative interventions, documents and guidelines, and on activities, for example, launching tenders, setting up ad hoc funds, defining project selection criteria, and so on. So these are preliminary to the subsequent effective implementation of the different projects. So the real tasks are ahead of us. Now, let me, after having given this introduction, let me say something about the plan. A preliminary assessment. My first and most important point is that it doesn't give an idea, a vision of what will be Italy's role in the transformations that are underway. There are technological, economic, environmental, social, geopolitical changes, and these will lead to a climate of profound uncertainty about future developments. They call for the definition of a clear, wide-ranging strategy that indicates the guidelines for the development and the objectives that the country intends to set itself. And this definition of a roadmap is important in the sense that it can help firms in taking decisions and committing resources for investments. So the many actions envisaged by the reform plan should be channeled within this vision. The research and innovation activities aimed towards concrete objectives that are consistent with the strategic vision adopted. And if you look at the plan, one gets lost in the multiplicity of actions, not always consistent with one another, entrusted to different ministries. And we also lose the sense of the way in which Italy will go. Where shall we be in 2030? Italy's role within Europe, within the international scenario, in the global division of labor, where do we want to stand? This is a question that is important, I would say, for the investment decision of the firms, and it's not really clearly set there. There are important complementarities and synergies that must be exploited in the plan. There is the need for continuous and effective coordination in the implementation of the various interventions between the ministries, between different levels of governance, between member states and the European Union. And these synergies must be exploited and better integrated within the vertical and horizontal elements of the plan. And let me give you two simple examples. The green and digital missions account for 52% of total funds, and renewable energy represent an important part of this horizontal policy. However, as has been argued by Garibaldo, the links with crucial features such as car production and steel making are indicated, but there are no times and quantities. It is said that the fleet of 6 million electric vehicles is expected by 2030, but how do we get there? And we can add that there are missing links with hydrogen plants, with battery fabs, and all the value chain. So another example is, well, there is a strong complementarity existing between the intervention envisaged under Transition 4.0 with those relating to the competitiveness and the strategic supply chains and the internationalization of small and medium enterprises. And these, again, should be connected and they interact with one another, not simply take it in emission 1 and another in emission 2 and never connect one with the other. The last point of connection and interconnection refers to the national and the EU level. There are interactions between industrial policies at the national and the European level to enhance cooperation and exploit complementarities. And again, the participation in European strategic supply chains represents a significant opportunity to strengthen national technological capabilities and align them with European objectives. So there is the need to define the place of the Italian industry in the European division of labor and in the new drivers of growth. Well, there are actions, there is this idea of complementarity with the European Union policies. For instance, encouraging the participation of Italian companies in the important projects of common European interest, where there is this suggestion for the expression of interest for microelectronics, hydrogen, cloud computing, and all that. However, integration with European projects should go beyond research and innovation and include sectors with large economies of scales, which require coordination at European level, but also more traditional sectors, and to pay particular attention to include small and medium enterprises in the supply chains and in this European-wide agreement. And then we come to the idea of the industrial policy. We have been, Francesco Saraceno this morning told us that there is a new idea of industrial policy running through Europe, which is true. There has been a change in industrial policy and competition rules at the EU level. Now we can talk about state aid, targeted support in research and development, technology, innovative sectors, even national champions. However, in the plan, we have still the basic approach to industrial policy seems to remain in line with the view that sees businesses and market forces as the main drivers of innovation, with the state confined to the role of financier. There is a division of labor between the state and the market also in the implementation of investment. Interventions on the infrastructure are considered the state's only responsibility, At the same time, everything concerning the production structure is the private sector's responsibility. I'm quoting again from Garibaldo. The plan seems to share the economists' distrust of the new industrial policy. There was a title in one of the last number of The Economist, which wrote like this: "Be aware of the bossy state, well-intentioned but ultimately a mistake. End up with inefficiency, vested interest, and insularity." Well, I think that this idea is underlying most of the missions, or at least the philosophy of the plan. And this results in the predominance of policies based on horizontal incentives. And this is the last point, perhaps, of this part of my presentation. Incentives dominate the scene in the plan. Take the interventions for digitalization in the Transition 4.0 chapter. They rely on a series of tax incentives such as hyper and super amortization, patent box, tax credit for research and development activities, and so on, as well as measures to facilitate access to credit, such as the so-called Nuova Sabatini law and the facilitation of access to the Fondo Centrale di Garanzia. These measures, which provide for a total endowment of approximately 19 billion euros, are part of the broader approach that favors an incentive mechanism targeted to the individual company. The small and medium enterprises that populate the Italian industry tend to access benefits of this kind rather than looking for alternative solutions, such as entering long-term more strategic programs. Therefore, individualized incentives do not seem able to fully channel public contributions into a path of digital transition and sustainable growth that brings new value to the Italian production chains. I'm quoting from Cerra and Crespi, who give some data. According to these data, Italy ranks first among the large EU economies for the share of companies that use cloud services. This share went up from 23 to 59% of the firms between 2018 and 2020. Italian companies are also in top position in other most advanced services, such as the use of Internet of Things, and in line with the European average in the use of artificial intelligence tools. Italy also ranks at the top for the degree of diffusion of robotics. It is 3 percentage points higher than Germany. Cerra and Crespi attribute this success to the tax incentives contained in the Industry 4.0 plan. But now we have this question: how is the digital prowess of individual firms to be reconciled with the mediocre performance of the productive system as a whole? If they are so good, how is it that we are growing so little and productivity is so bad? And here we try to answer this question in our book, Celi et altri, starting from a paper by Ginsburg, who was titled, I think, "The Isolated Firm is a Fiction." What makes regions innovative is not the existence of individual innovative firms, but systems or networks of firms that collectively act as an experimental laboratory. And this, I think, is what differentiates the automotive ecosystem of the Emilia-Romagna region from other northern regions with a substantial automotive supply chain. And this is contained in this study, ANFIA 2021. So the goal should be to develop a more integrated and competitive industrial ecosystem made up of various players of different sizes with common vision and objectives and pursuing complementary investment. The creation of networks in which leading companies, including state-owned enterprises, can support the growth of the supply chains, favoring the growth and competitiveness of small and medium enterprises that are part of it, contributing to the development of a more integrated and competitive industrial ecosystem. So research infrastructures and large enterprises should act as research and development poles, capable of offering the necessary knowledge base to small and medium enterprises. And this, be aware, is the policy of other European Union countries, UK, Germany, and France. They are targeting the country's strategic clusters with the aim of guiding the production chains and using the national champions of reference to guide the growth of clusters of small and medium enterprises. So this is already been done. A further point, perhaps the last one, is the interaction between supply and demand. The design of both the measures of the construction of networks and the actions to stimulate demand within the same time frame increases the effectiveness of the solution adopted. Here we can talk about public procurement and minding the domestic content of the goods that investments are requiring. And once again, just in order to see that I'm not talking abstract, sustained domestic production is an important point, for instance, in the case of electric buses. The Ministry of Sustainable Infrastructure and Mobility, which is the translation of the Ministero delle Infrastrutture Sostenibili e la Mobilità, is committed to identifying resources to finance an investment relating to the electric bus supply chain. The measure is aimed at stimulating the market on the supply side, also in light of the huge investments for the renewal of the bus fleets, which is envisioned by the national plan. So, trying to put together supply and demand, different parts of the plan. So, but actually, this is the idea. But what is being done to organize production and internal supply? Is this mission coordinated with the ones aimed at developing hydrogen and battery swaps, with the measures needed to support the automotive components and parts, with the EU green energy policy? I mean, all these parts, different, scattered through all the plan, need to be put together in order to make a coherent plan, a sectoral plan, or, I mean, putting together demand and supply. So how to proceed? Well, I think that this plan provides an opportunity to achieve sustainable growth under certain conditions. It needs to respond to structural requirements of the economy. And to do that, we need an analysis of main bottlenecks, the supply constraints, the import dependence, the need to catch up on innovation, the geographical divide, and after the analysis, devise a strategy which links the specific sectorial targets within a coherent national design. And here we don't have to look only to innovative sectors, green and digital economy, sustainable mobility, but we need to support what already exists, the traditional sectors of specialization, helping them to innovate and move up to new products and technologies. So I don't know, how much time do I have, Sergio?
5 minutes.
5 minutes. So I'm
7 minutes.
7 minutes. So I'm going through a bit. This slide wants to show that, I mean, there is this idea of having to make together different actors, different agents, different institutions. For instance, the plan strengthens research and development in the most innovative areas and provides for the coordination of various players. If we read the official explanation of the plan, we see that the aim of the intervention is to encourage and stimulate the growth of an innovation ecosystem, with particular focus on the sectors of the green transition, renewable, sustainable mobility, energy efficiency, circular economy, waste treatment, batteries, all together through direct and indirect venture capital investments. To this end, the intervention provides for the introduction of a dedicated fund with an investment strategy focused on specific sectors and covering the various stages of development, with investments in the most critical venture capital funds, with a green focus in startups and incubators, acceleration programs supporting the most relevant venture capital managers and system operators. So we know the theory, but what is planned for traditional sectors that are one important part of the Italian economy? We need to defend the existing industry. And here again, let me give you the case of the automotive supply chain, which is important in terms of employment, in terms of turnover, in terms of value added, 6.2% of GDP. The future of the Italian supply chain largely depends on Stellantis' choices with regard to rationalization of plants in the EU, where to put design, production, and component supply chain activities. The southern supply chain, in particular, is heavily dependent on Stellantis orders. And moreover, the entire supply chain must also cope with the challenges of electric and autonomous driving, calling for diversification of products and technologies. So, innovation of specific firms will not suffice. Companies in the supply chain must undertake collaborative efforts to build critical mass and engage in ambitious development projects. So they do need a plan at the national and European level, and this cannot be left behind. Also because the European Union is actually very active. It put 2.9 billion funding for batteries, has launched a hydrogen strategy for climate neutral Europe, besides tightening the rules of carbon emissions. Germany is coordinating investment at the lender basis, ensuring cooperation among the various public and private actors, and the same is doing France. Italy has ambitious projects in green transition and new mobility. There are at least 4 projects for gigafactories for batteries. Stellantis is one of them. But how do we integrate these various projects within a national policy for the automotive industry? The last point is taking inequality seriously. Many projects will be undertaken at the local, regional, municipal level. And here, there are huge differences in technical competence and financial capacity. Regions with greater administrative capacity and or with more money to co-finance projects may obtain more resources. The case of nurseries that have just been financed, or at least the tender have just come out, and I'm quoting a paper by Kenny in January. In the distribution of funds through tenders, due to lack of administrative capacity, entire territories could remain partially or totally uncovered. And premiality in case of co-financing by the local authority could reward richer regions, irrespective of need. And this could explain why Lombardy, with certainly not among the regions with a greater need for services, is instead the second region for allocated funds. Again, the minimum size of the tender, which is pretty high, may exceed the financial and technical capacity of small municipalities. So it is not sufficient to say that 40% of funds will go to the south, and this for at least 2 reasons. The first reason is that Italy continues to experience divergent industrial paths between a north, where digitization has already been undertaken by mixed ecosystems of industry and services, and the south still falling behind. So this divide cannot be solved only with business incentives and infrastructure programs, even if these are necessary. It requires a public policy of specific and targeted interventions, which favor the creation of ecosystems. And the second point is that in order to be operated, physical infrastructure and investments require current expenditure for their operation and maintenance. Nurseries, schools, hospitals need teachers, nurses, doctors. So adequate funding must be foreseen in future budgets and addressed also to the southern regions. Moreover, it should be defined whether these funds will be directed towards public expenditure or to subsidize the private provision of these services. Will be provided
to conclude.
Yeah, provided to municipalities or transformed into vouchers. So last slide, what is missing in the national reform program? Well, it is mostly capital intensive investments. So employment creation is light compared with the amount of expenditure. And the cross priorities, gender, youth, are disconnected from the functioning of the labor market. The issue of employment is taken mostly in terms of skill mismatch, which is not the only problem that we have in the labor market. And wages and income distribution are one of the main omissions. And this is important in order to understand also what will be the role of the multiplier of these investment. Wages are also purchasing power, not only a cost for the firms. So, and this is my concluding, it's it can be a great opportunity or also a risky bet. The government estimates that the investment envisaged in the plan will have a significant impact on the macroeconomic variables, but the final outcome will depend on how the feared weaknesses that I have talking about and the necessary adjustments in itinere, how these two interact. And I think that there is still time to try to make the plan more coherent and more responding to a vision that we have to find. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna, for your very interesting presentation, to having shown us the importance of the true industrial policy. And we cannot but hope that the NHR plan will be a success because its impact on the GDP will be very important in determining the future trend of the public debt income ratio. And so we have already a question from the audience by Francesco Saraceno. So please, Francesco.
Hi, thank you very much. It was very interesting. My question is very quick, actually. In slide 14, you said that, no, because I noted it. It was the one on industrial policy, and you say that the France and the UK managed to create the environment, if you want. I would like you to be a bit more specific on these differences. What should be done in Italy?
Mm-hmm.
Because I see the debate here in France about industrial policy. They don't seem to be so proud of it. So I was wondering, what do you think we should copy in Italy?
Other question from the audience? Antonella Palumbo.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your speech, Anna, and also for the previous presentation. Was very interesting. I don't know if I can also take the opportunity to make a double question, but maybe it's not. Okay. No, talking about Anna's presentation, there are just two things that I would like to understand better. I think that your presentation was extremely brilliant and important in showing us what a true industrial policy should be, as Sergio said, but I'm not clear whether you were explicitly thinking of a role for the public firm, the public enterprise, because I thought that it was implicit maybe in some of your remarks, but it's not necessarily so. So I would like to know better your thought on these. And also a very quick remark about your first part, when you said that actually we possibly are not able to spend all the money that we should spend in this little time. But on the other hand, we are rightly, I think, criticizing European rules because they prevent us from spending enough, from spending all what we need. So what is the solution here? It's a question of timing, or it's a question of the kind of expenditures that are allowed? So this is my question, yes.
Okay, so Anna, you have 5 minutes to answer to all these questions.
In 5 minutes, we can ask Francesco to explain what the friends are doing. Mario Tiberio,
you must switch on your phone, otherwise we do not listen you. I can switch, perhaps I can do. Yes, now.
You hear me now?
Yes, yes.
Okay.
Listen.
Mario.
Well, very short, but I want to say just a few words from the point of view of an interventionist, because I think that I'm very satisfied with Anna's presentation, because she has shown that this PNRR is really a big challenge for the interventionist culture. So I think we shouldn't underestimate the importance of this opportunity. I say that especially because there are very much younger people attending the conference. So I want to leave this message, like a sermon, to these people. Because there are, Anna emphasized in some points which are some, points that must be deepened. I don't want to come back to that. The only observation that I want to do to Anna's presentation is there should be a chapter, to say 1 2 slides more, on the institutional aspects. That is to say, which are the bodies, interventionist bodies that should take on this challenge, not only institutional in a strict sense, but I'm also thinking of the trade unions that, in my opinion, should play a very important role in intervening in this process, and that imply for me to face the problem of what we call economic democracy, in the sense that is a real challenge, cultural challenge for the trade unions, to see which could be the way to interfere in the activity of private firms. I think that is a crucial point that must be deepened. Thank you.
Thank you, Mario. And so now, Anna, you have 2 minutes to answer to all the questions.
Let me take the questions in the inverse order. Mario, well, I think that it is important to stress one thinks that are the shortcomings, because there is still time. My last sentence was there is still time. And since it has been done so quickly, so hastily, there is time to try to make the connection between the different points and try to make up a vision for where we want to go in the different sectors and in Italy on the whole. So it is not a disruptive critique, I would say. It's an important point in order to make the adjustments in itinerary that we think are needed. And I think that we need to discuss on these perhaps needed corrections. Just in the idea that you are suggesting that we need to make all social partners participating into the discussion. What needs to be changed? There is time. They have not yet started to make the expenditure. So how do we activate a dialogue, a discussion between not only the parliament, not only the government, not only the local governments, but also the social partners, the trade unions, the economists. Let's try to discuss what are missing and what are the points that are to be saved and to be reinforced. So, Antonella, capacity to spend. Well, the public enterprises are there. They are put together with bigger firms. They have a, let's say, mission to perform, and they can play the role of leaders of the value chains, or to make some investments that are midway between infrastructure, between the private field. So I think that although not mentioned perhaps only once and in passing, they can play a role. The capacity to spend, well, it's not only a problem of timing, it's also a problem of the ability of the public administration, of the excess bureaucracy. Perhaps simplification is an important step, although it needs to be controlled in order not that it results in a free-for-all. So I think that this is a point, is an important point, and it needs a sort of rejuvenation of the public administration and of the rules. Saraceno, this is not a simple question, but let me go back to the example of automotive. We have fabs and batteries on mission. I'm not taking the right mission, just to mission 1, for instance. We have innovation and industry point 4 at mission 4, and we have different sustainability, mobility, sustainable mobility, and public e-vehicles in another. So we need to put the thing together. And we have also the supply chain of parts and components in the north. They are going to be swept away. And when you mention that French economists are not particularly enthusiastic of their industrial policy, but nonetheless, Macron tried, Le Maire tried to put together a sort of industrial policy. They may not succeed, but at least they are trying. I mean, when they said to the new Stellantis that they should take inshore more of the supply chain production, they were trying to do something in order to defend the national ecosystem of the automotive industry. Correct, not correct, we can discuss that, but at least there is the idea that it is necessary to do something. And the same is doing Germany with the automotive sector. Automotive is very important in Germany. The car is king in the German economy. And once again, they are putting a lot of money. They are also sort of lobbying the European Union. We have all these funds going to batteries, to hydrogen. It's not a chance that there is this. I mean, so it's a problem of at least trying to think how a sector can be put together and reinforced.
Thank you, Anna, again. And now our last speech by Gennaro Zezza on a medium-term perspective for the Italian economy. So, Gennaro, I give you the floor.
Okay, thank you. I think I can
see your slides, if you have slides, if you would like to share slides with us.
I was late because I had some trouble connecting with the Teams app. So I'm using the browser, which is quite slow.
Okay.
I hope you can see them now.
Yes, yes, we see them.
Okay. Thank you very much for inviting me. And I was asked to talk about the prospects for the Italian economy, since this is what I usually do as my main research activity. But actually, when I agreed to participate, I thought they had enough time to prepare a model simulation. As you may know, we have developed a complex stock flow consistent model, mainly made by my young co-author, which is also my son. But the sides of the COVID shock, together with some changes that ISTAT is making on labor force statistics, suggested to avoid the risk of not having any results. So I will mainly discuss this issue. What are the structural causes of the Italian decline before COVID, and is the NGEU program able to address them? So this is what I will try to discuss quite quickly today. So we all know, I think, the path that the Italian economy has taken in the last decades, and I'm using a comparison with the other 3 large Eurozone countries. And I also want to focus on the regional divide which we have, and this is in the level of real GDP per capita between the North and the South. And it is also interesting to notice that the divide has widened after roughly 2010, which, as I will shortly discuss, is when the austerity kicked in. So from my first chart, as we all know, Italy was growing in line with her European partners, but from roughly the year 2000, the growth rate started to stagnate. And then we had the Great Recession. The impact of the Great Recession was large in Italy. And the problem mainly came after that with the sovereign debt crisis of 2011 and the COVID-19 pandemic made the final blow. So you can see that in 2009, Italian GDP fell more or less in line with the others, but in 2012, it kept falling while the other countries were recovering. And the austerity programs which were put in place mainly by the Monti government in 2011 and afterwards are part of the story. So what are the reasons for this decline and this stagnation? And the mainstream story is mainly relying on supply side determinants. So the large ownership, family ownership of firms, rules about management, and so on. In a paper with Sergio Cesarato and we focused on also demand side factors. It is certainly true that in the 80s, the monetary stance changed from allowing the refinancing of government deficit to this divorce with the Treasury, from allowing for devaluation of the lira to a regime which was trying to aim at the implementation of the euro, but and this led some people to make a very strict relation between the adoption of the euro and the stagnation of the Italian economy. But other factors were also at work. The privatization, which started also in the 1980s and continued afterwards, implied the end of some large public companies, which according to many were strong contributors of research and development with spillovers to the private industries. We had labor market reforms which were aimed at improving the occupability, we may say, and to remove a number of restriction on the ability of firms to hire and fire. As a consequence of many of these policies, we had a concentration of income and wealth, and especially after 2011, we had a period of austerity. So there are a few slides on some of the also supply side determinants of the stagnation. The first one is shared with, not with Germany, but with the other two countries, is the decline in manufacturing. And as we all know, manufacturing is the sector with the largest growth in productivity. So a lower share of this industry will mathematically imply a lower growth in productivity. The other important point, which everyone keeps repeating, is the small size of firms. And now, for the benefit of our younger listeners, I want to emphasize that I'm using the accounts of the institutional sectors, which are a publication of the national accounts, which almost nobody uses other than those of us who do stock flow consistent models. But these institutional sector accounts do provide a lot of insights into what is happening in the economy. So here, as a measure, as a macroeconomic measure of the small size of firms in the Italian economy compared to the others, I've taken the gross operating surplus and mixed income of the household sector, which includes all small firms, compared to that of the non-financial corporations. And so this is saying that the gross profits, which we could say of small firms in Italy, are larger than that of the corporations, which is a feature which never happens elsewhere. Now, I want to say something following what Anna Maria Simonazzi, who made a brilliant speech, said a few minutes ago. And many commentators are saying that the small size of Italian firms is what is the main reason why we don't have innovation, the main reason why we are not growing. But to paraphrase, I think, another example that I've listened recently, it is certainly true that an economy with medium-sized internationalized firms will grow faster and have higher innovation and higher productivity than an economy with small-sized firms. But if the transition to such a medium-sized firms economy is going to take 20 years, what's happening in these 20 years? Are we going to have all these small firms go out of business and with the implications for poverty, unemployment, etc.? Or isn't it better to have a vision, a strategy which tries to defend somehow the strength of these small firms and find another path for growth? Another aspect of why the economy is not growing so fast is the low level of investment. Now, this is the investment of non-financial corporations compared to the other countries, and is certainly lower. So I asked myself, but is this due to lower profits? And if we look at the gross operating surplus, the gross profits, we could say that Italian firms are getting, they are not so lower than those in the other countries. So why is investment so low? The data say that while the profits are roughly in line with the other economies, also the dividends are quite high or even a little higher. And that is the reason why net profits, which are called saving of financial corporations, are the lowest among these four economies. Since we know that net profits or saving are one source of investment, so this may be another another potential cause of the low level of investment in Italy. Now, when we talk about productivity growth does not come so much on the effort of workers, but on the amount also of capital per worker which is available. So low investment will be conducive to low growth. As the various labor market reforms worked in order to increase the employment rate and so on, and I don't think that this has happened. What has happened is an increase in the instability of the labor market. We have the largest share of workers with a part-time job who are working part-time because they could not find a full-time job, or are working part-time but they would like to switch to a full-time job. So this may go hand in hand with the stagnation of the real wages that we have experienced, and which is also another possible determinant of the slow growth in domestic demand, and therefore the slow growth in GDP, real GDP. Then the COVID-19 shock came, and Italy has not done so bad compared to the other countries in recovering from the shock so far. These latest data for the third quarter of 2021. The problem we have is that this has increased the divide between the north and the south. So the south has been hit harder by the pandemic, the closures due to the pandemic. And this is a projection made by Svimets in last December, which is quite depressing, because this is without taking into account the effects of the NGU funds. But it shows that the south of Italy is not expected to recover to its 2008 level, even in the next 5 years or so. And the projection with the NGU funds shows that it will take another 5 years with these additional funds only to go back to the real GDP per capita that the South had in 2008. So let's try to see whether these NGU funds are on target given the problems that I've summarized. We all know the 6 main goals that have also been discussed previously. Is everything all right? Yes. And if we go through the description of these goals, we almost always find the mention of the need to achieve geographical cohesion, inclusion, that the South is lagging behind, and therefore these measures should be also aimed at closing this divide. But whether we will succeed is another story. I completely agree with what Anna Simonazzi said earlier. The ability to implement the investment projects of the NGU program will depend on the quality of the local public administration, and also in some cases, as the nurseries, on the possibility of co-funding the European funds with regional funds, and this has already penalized some southern regions. Now, these are the amounts of the funds that are available for grants and loans, etc. And this has already been shown in previous presentations. It's quite a lot of money. This is the distribution over time of these funds. As someone else already remarked, it is important to notice that Italy is one of the few large countries who asked for the loans and not just for the grants. And it's also useful to remind, as a partial change to what Anna Maria Simonazzi said before, that loans will have to be paid back, obviously, but also grants in some sense will have to be paid back because they are on the European Commission budget, and Italy is a net contributor in normal times to the European budget. So when it will come to pay back these grants on the European budget, Italy will have to do its share, give its share. The figures I have in this chart are taken from this document which our Ministry Franco signed on December 22nd with Paolo Gentiloni, who represented the European Commission. I don't know whether all of you have seen this document, and this is a 759 pages, in which in the first pages there is a list of disbursements that will be made every 6 months to Italy if a number of targets have been met. And the other 700 plus pages are listing all these targets in some detail. Now, I wonder if all of our politicians in Parliament had the opportunity to discuss in a commission the details of this very long list of reforms, which goes from reforming how the courts operate or how public procurement is organized, and so on and so forth. But I have the suspicion, after looking at this document, that as economists we are concentrating on the economic impact of the NGU program, but there is also a political side of this program which should be discussed. So adopting this document, the Italian government, the current Italian government, has committed future governments to follow this road plan. And I wonder, and I'm really ignorant about this, I wonder how much the electorate and the parliament are aware of the possibility, as Anna Maria Simonazzi was saying, of changing or not changing the agreements that have been made. What we've seen in 2011 with Greece was that once you had signed a memorandum of agreement, there was nothing you could do to change it. So if you had new elections and the new government went to power, they could not change any comma of the European agreement. So I wonder whether this is clear enough to everyone, and whether if something goes wrong, whether this will be used by so-called populist parties as to strengthen the divide with Europe. So will the NGU program address the problems that I've mentioned before? Will we have higher private investment other than that financed from the NGU program? Will we see an increase in real wages for all workers? Will something be done on the distribution of income? I really doubt that. And maybe more importantly, will we have any shift in austerity policies which have been run so far? And will we address the problem of the regional divide? So, in principle, the NGU should be very effective for addressing the regional divide, because it will be a large amount of money which goes to southern regions compared to the northern regions. If we believe in regional multipliers, then these investments should have even larger impact. I have had this slide because my co-author, working on the same lines as the lady we presented earlier today, has produced these multipliers using this fashionable structural VARS approach. So this is also to suggest that this money will have an impact, a larger impact in the north, but a sizable impact also in the south. But I have some doubts that this is going to happen unless we fill a gap, which I think is a priority. And the gap is something I discussed in the Astril conference 2 years ago, but I think is still here. And we have maybe not everyone is aware of this, but we have a small amount of public employees when compared to the other European Union countries, and a larger part of our public employees is old and with respect to other countries. So in order to tackle these incredible NGU plan with all its complexities, we would need very quickly an increase of public officers recruited among young, talented persons. We should be paid well according to their skills and have don't be hired on temporary contracts because this is not going to work. So I've seen that the government has hired a large number of people already, but in most cases with short-term contracts and salaries which were in many cases not up to the standard. So this is not directly possible on NGU funds. So, but if this is not done before trying to implement the various aspects of the plan may be doomed to fail. So the other question I want to put on the table, and I'm almost close to my conclusion, is we will need to pay back these NGU funds. The payment will be away in the future, so we should not really make it a priority on how are we going to pay back these funds. But I think that this is already obsessing our politicians, and maybe because many of the decisions which have been taken implied short-term contracts for employees in the health sector, employees in the other parts of the public administration. I was in a meeting a couple of days ago with colleagues in my university for discussing the participation of our department to NGU plans. And what I understood, I may be wrong, but what I understood is that if we succeed, we will have funds which we never saw before, but only to hire temporary research officers, and therefore not to structurally increase the quantity and quality of our supply of education. So if this is what is going to happen, and I think this is what is going to happen, we will have a strong impact on the economy, but only a temporary impact on the economy. And when we will start thinking on how to pay back all this, then the impact will be reversed. I am pessimistic on the fact that our politicians have understood that austerity is not the way to go to reduce the debt to GDP ratio, but the way to go is to increase GDP. If they don't switch to this policy and implement again reduction in current spending, then I think the stimulus of the NGU will be short-lived. A lot will depend on the discussion of the new European Union rules, and Francesco Saraceno did a great job in discussing some of this. I'm very much interested in the proposal he made with Massimo Amato of a European Debt Agency, which I think goes in the right direction. I know there are a number of proposals on how to change the rules, and I just want to stress that any rules based on national indicators, such as the potential output. So I know there is a proposal to have government expenditure not exceeding the growth in potential output for the country as a whole. But if we have Mezzogiorno, the south, which is not growing, and the north, which is growing, then it is more difficult with this type of rules to have a policy aimed at closing the gaps. So I closed here. I just want to drop the last question. Did we really need to accept this NGU plan? Given that we are now able to finance ourselves at a low rate, couldn't we achieve our domestic targets in line with the European targets with the different proposals? Why did we ask for the loans instead of just taking the grants, which are obviously a very important step? I don't want to answer this question, but I'm closing here, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Gennaro, and I agree with you that conditionalities may really be a problem and that we need an employment plan, especially for the public sector. I have only a question looking at your slides. It seems that you believe that the cause of the low levels of investment in Italy in the last decades resides in low net profits, but perhaps other factors such as the low expected trend of aggregate demand have been more relevant. But it's my impression. Looking at your slide, this seems to be your idea. So
I agree with you, but
so
what you say is better known.
There is a question by Antonella Stiratemi. So please, Antonella, we have 5-10 minutes, no more, because the parallel session are starting.
Just 1 second, because Gennaro already answered my question that was a follow-up on yours, in the sense that I wanted to say maybe there is the causation is the opposite. Since your net profits are retained profit, basically, I think, maybe the amount of retained profits depends on how much the firms want to invest. So could it be that the causation goes the other way around? Since investments are low, then retained profits are low, and more is given out as dividends.
Dividends, yes. Yes. Mm.
Maybe.
Maybe.
To be fashionable, I will run a VAR to check the Granger causality.
But Granger causality, you know, it's... Other question from the audience? No, it doesn't seem so. I really thank to everyone. I think that it has been a very interesting discussion. I really thanks again Roberto, Anna, and Gennaro for their participation. And so we look again in the parallel session. Bye-bye to everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. Ciao Roberto.
Ciao, ciao.
Ciao.
Ciao.